Hello, Wednesday, 8 o'clock. We are at it again. So I am Jared Kubika Miller, DebateSensei, and Tim Seavey here from Visolutions.
How's it going?
All right. And Matt is starting some sourdough starter right now, and it's really kind of time sensitive. So we wanted to get to that first. All right. We wanted to talk about the topic that was released just today. Well, you know, depending on where you are time zone wise, you know, I mean, I guess for us, it was 10 o'clock last night. But if you're Central Time, it was midnight. It's the NFA-LD topic. Yeah. I mean, it seems like it came up out of nowhere. And so let's see here. How we go here? No. So I'm going to bring it up. We got resolved. The United States federal government should implement immigration reform that removes substantial statutory restrictions on legal immigration in the United States. All right. So I think that I just want to like get in real time kind of show people like the thought process. As soon as you get a topic like this, what are some of the things that you first come across, right? And this will just kind of be like a snapshot in time about if you put in just, you know, a couple hours of work and what are some of the things that you come up with? What is your approach? I don't expect any of these things to like withstand the test of time. But you know what I mean? It's just kind of like, all right, what's the first stuff that you're coming across, and let's get the discussion started. So what was your approach, Tim?
Whenever, honestly, just about any topic like this comes up, I don't know if it was just the way that I debated or the way my brain works. I go for like the most extreme possible solution and then work my way back to what's reasonable. And I think part of it is because the most fun debates are the ones that are really like pushing the envelope of what is possible in a policy situation, right? At least I find those really enjoyable. I think the real world, you end up generally with incremental little small changes. And I think one of the beautiful things about debate and forensics is that you get to kind of intellectually test big ideas that, like, sure, this policy may not ever actually pass through the House or you know, the Senate would never say yes to this, but we get to talk about it as if they did. What would be the real benefits? What would be the real drawbacks? What would actually happen if something like that happened? So I know a lot of times we've run eliminate borders, right? Like that would be a way to substantially reduce statutory limitations on immigration. Like, so that's a really big one that I don't think will probably stick quite as much in LD this upcoming year as it has historically with Parley. I think it's done a lot better in Parley because it's big as a policy idea, and then you can have like 50 different advantages that go along with it that makes it a little more tricky to like on the fly prepare for. But I think knowing that that will happen, I think negative strategies in LD will probably win over because there's just some like logistical difficulties that come up with it. That in Parley, you kind of can just like wave your hands and like, yeah, but also there's this that I think LD would do a better job of picking apart. But that's where I go. So I start at like the most extreme, then start working back and look at what existing policies are on the docket. But I don't think that's going to be legit in this one. So, I mean, one of the things that you and I were talking about when we had the video before, talking like the immigration subject in general, we came to the conclusion of like, there's an election happening. There's no way of knowing what the immigration policy is going to be. Like in this debate season, immigration policy will dramatically change. Like it will be hugely different than it is right now. So
I think people got to get people got to get really prepared for like to change any inherency stories right around you know the if not right in November, then in January when the next inauguration comes in, unless Trump gets reelected, man, because then you're like, all right, I guess we're going with the same thing, you know. And so I think that's going to be interesting.
Or more stringent. Like I still think that one way or another policy will change, though. I think like even if it is the same administration, and like, you know, which way the House is going to go, right? Like there's a lot of seats that are up for grabs this cycle coming around. Like if the House goes a way that people don't necessarily expect, policy may become even more restrictive, right? So I think that there's a lot of avenue for that. So when you're considering some plan or some idea that's got to last a year, where do you go with it? Like,
Well,
what's your kind of thought process on that?
I don't know if I approach it that way. Whenever I hear a topic, and this might be for my like limited prep sort of approach to debate, but I kind of jump to what are the stories of the day that are dealing with this? What are the closest things that you see in the headlines? And the things that you see are like detention centers and building the wall and stuff like that, or the H-1B visa, like basically halting that. That's also something. And so I jump to those things. I kind of go, all right, what are the arguments that people are making? I just want to be familiar with them. You know what I mean? I just want like a touchstone. And so that is what usually helps generate some ideas. Like for one thing, I was looking at, it made me look closer at the wording of the resolution, because the wording of the resolution is to remove substantial statutory restrictions, right?
Yeah. Can you pull it up on the screen, by the way, so we can see that?
Let me see. You know what? If I can.
If not, it's totally okay. It just would be useful to be able to talk about it while we see it.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. They had a lot of different possible wordings, like NFA does that. And so we already knew it was going to be on immigration, that we talked about before. But the wording they went with, I think, was the one that we all hoped that they would go for. It was substantially reduce statutory limitations or statutory restrictions, right?
Yeah.
Be a lot of good LDC drills.
Remove statutory restrictions. Here, let me see if I can. I think I can do this now. So the thing about the no. Yeah, I can't get that right now. Okay,
no worries.
The thing is, though, that with statutory restrictions, stuff like the detention centers and stuff like the H-1B visas, those are executive orders. Those aren't statutory, right? Statutes are things that are like, by definition, you could just pull up any sort of. I checked a bunch of different definitions, even Wikipedia, but like you go Oxford, Blacks, stuff like that, and it's all about stuff that goes through legislative bodies. Executive orders might have the force of law, but that doesn't mean that they are statutory restrictions. In fact, if you want to solve that problem, you might want to add statutory restrictions on the president. So it would be almost like a real, like an odd sort of, semantic way of being, like anti-topical, like this sort of really outdated way of phrasing a counterplan. But still, I think it's kind of, it's kind of cool. I'm not, you know what, Swishfish, I don't know if it's, I know that it's, if you're talking high school, the LD is very different, because high school LD is much more value oriented. This is policy oriented, and they just came out with their topic today. And so we're talking about like policy ideas that are coming up. And so even if you are going to be talking about detention centers, if you want to go old school and go with like the inherency takeout, because the courts ruled that they have to release, them. That's one way, but you could also talk about how these aren't statutory restrictions. These are executive orders, and so like it's you get a little technical and procedural on that point, but it's I don't know, it's a strategy.
And I would actually say for those that are competing in NSDA, still it is still a value oriented debate, but as I've seen, it is becoming substantially more policy-esque. And that's like where college currently is. I think if you're looking ahead at the highest levels in high school, like it's becoming more policy-esque. So thinking in the same kind of ways.
Yeah. So, but you definitely are beholden to like the stock issues. If you read the rules of NFA, you got to have harms, inherency, and solvency in there. It's like you got to be topical, you know what I mean? And so like it's kind of kind of an old school way. It doesn't mean that that's what everyone always does. I've seen as long as you get the right audience, you're running all sorts of arguments and stuff like that. But yeah, it is one of the ones that kind of codifies what arguments the affirmative is supposed to make, which is like I don't come across that too often.
Yeah, so I think one of the points that you made before we were chatting about the likelihood that people are going to be passing new policies, right? Like that's the common solution, or in just about any case, if it's like, oh, we're going to reform this thing. Well, okay, let's go ahead and pass a policy. How likely that is if a new policy is passed that is extra topical, because the resolution is to remove limitations. So if you remove them and then pass new policy, you made a good point on that. Like, how would you combat that, right?
Yeah.
Like, how would you go about dealing with that? Like, if you are, on the affirmative side, do you only have the capability to take away existing legislation? Is that it? Or can you pass something instead of, and that counts as removing?
Yeah. Like, I was like, one of the other ways I approached this was I just started looking up what the restrictions are. And like, if I had a list of them and I just kind of picked which one I would remove. Like, so there's a good website. The American Immigration Council has a nice little breakdown of immigration policy, and it's just so complicated. They have quotas and ceilings and percentages that fluctuate with every decision that they make. Like the system is kaput, man. It sucks really bad. Yeah. And so and like they did a pretty good job like bringing it down. But I also just looked up, I just literally Googled, legal immigration restrictions, and so it popped up, and like Wikipedia has a list of immigration laws. That's a place to start, you know what I mean? Right. And they also point you to the code. I just literally opened up the US code, and they have, Title 8 of the US code is the immigration and naturalization laws. And I was looking through, and one of them says restrictions on who's not allowed in. And it says like anyone who is like convicted of prostitution in the last 10 years. I'm like, you know what? I'd get rid of that. Yeah. I'd get rid of that. You know what I mean? Like, and there you go. There's my case. You know what I mean? It's like, I think that's one way of doing it. Just, I'm like, give me a list of what the restrictions are. I'll pick the one that I think I have the best arguments for, and boom, we're off to the races.
That's a good idea. I think where there is outstanding negative ground here is if negative teams are able to, really kind of hold AF teams to the, like, you are only, that means negative ground is all new immigration policy, right? And like, so sure, you can, deal with like some perm there, but that's a huge playground to play in. Like the negative team now can do anything, right? So like if you say, okay, remove the restriction on, having been convicted of prostitution, like, okay, great. Like we're gonna meanwhile, like completely overhaul the system of visas, and like, the negative team can do a million other things. So I think counterplaying the sky is the limit at this point, which it always has been, and that's why it's kind of fun in that way. But I think this unfortunately really pits the affirmative teams to such a narrow point that the potential advantages garnered by removing certain restrictions versus fixing systematically messed up things that we've got going on, right? Like really truly broken systems that need to be repaired. Yeah. I don't know if you can necessarily do that by just removing some stuff. So I think that's really kind of place the affirmative teams at a disadvantage there.
Yeah, I think the negative, I mean, like it starts, it's like, all right, see you later, Squishfish. All right. So I think that, what was I saying? That the competition on the counter plan starts, it becomes an issue, because if you limit yourself to just something and then you're like, yeah, I could, just perm anything that you say on top, in addition to it, you got to have that prepared for your rebuttals. You got to, and there's ways of doing that, but it becomes, sometimes, so you could just pick like one of those things. I saw that like in order to become a US citizen, there's also an English requirement. I'm like, why don't you just get rid of that? Because then you could go to like the English as a national language debate, and all that lit right there. Now you can start using for this one pretty much, but it like flips the size. It's interesting.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was reading was coming from, it was the Center for American Progress. And it was discussing how there's no, hiding the fact that it's functionally impossible to legally immigrate, like to really follow the law to the T is nearly impossible. Like they make it such that policy makers have to kind of warp the rules, and people along the way, along the process of someone becoming documented citizen, have to kind of like bend stuff you can't come legally, like to come on a visa and become a citizen. There's so many, obstacles and hoops to jump through that it makes it almost impossible. So we have this tremendously high bar of law, and then this, differing, legislations or bodies of legislation or differing presidents or different leadership will have different feelings about that of like, all right, do we hold someone to that standard or do we lower that standard? And so it makes it almost it devalues really the law itself when there's really almost no way to follow that clearly. So I think that it makes sense to say like, all right, we're going to, go about reducing that. But I think they made a good point in saying if the law is unclear, people are not going to follow it. So like just the bringing it down to the fundamentals of what a law should do. So immigration policy, defining what immigration policy should do, I think is going to be a really like useful piece of background that hasn't been present in previous topics, right? Like you're talking national security or you're talking green tech, like those things are very straightforward, like, the problem they're trying to solve. I think when you're talking about something as gnarly, literally as immigration policy, you have to talk about why we need it at all and what it's supposed to do. Because I don't think a lot of people would even agree on what immigration policy is supposed to do, right? Like, what it ideally should be. So if everyone can agree on what it is supposed to, at least you can frame a better debate. So I would think that policies that are, removing pieces out of this, just be prepared to have most of these rounds happen in the perm debate of like, who can actually garner better advantages of replacing the, ridiculously messy system we already have.
Yeah. I think the interesting sort of like side debate, the meta debate that I ran into in doing this is kind of like, well, what's the best approach? Is like, is the problem that we have too many laws? You know what I mean? Or it is the problem that like like there's too much authority resting in one person's hands on this. You know what I mean? It's like, and so like maybe more restrictions would be good, but it needs to be restricting the people making decisions. You know what I mean? So like because I was like trying my best to read as much of the immigration code, which is impossible in one day. You know what I mean? But I'm like reading sections of it and stuff like that, and they have things like, it's like, okay, we're not bringing people who murder other people in their home countries into our country. You know what I mean? It's like some of these things are just like, yeah, I'm okay with that restriction on there. You know what I mean? It's like a lot of these restrictions that I read about in the paper seem to come from one person rather than the law. You know what I mean? And so that's why I'm like, okay, the things that seem like legal restrictions are like language. I'm like, I think we could come up with arguments on that, like financial restrictions as well. You know what I mean? Like more stuff like that. But if you really want to get limited, I came across one really sort of like niche debate. You know that American Samoans are not citizens?
You're kidding.
They're nationals.
What the hell's the difference?
They can't vote, man.
See, like there's just the number of like ways that the policy has been fractured to fit like this particular little thing is just the messiest.
But there's legislation, there's a bill out there to just like make that like you can be a citizen. And so
so how do you feel about going? So oftentimes when it's something that's a major overhaul, right? Like you talk the healthcare debate. One of the easiest routes is to say, like, let's look at other industrialized countries that have done this really well. Whose system do we want to rip off the most? And like that's generally like not a bad place to start. How do you feel about that for something like immigration? Because I think there's a really great case to be made that, like, the American multicultural society that we have is exceptional. Like American exceptionalism is the way that we like, push off all of those other arguments. Like other countries do this. And we're like, yeah, but screw those other countries because this is America. And we don't have really great justification for it besides like, we're different, which is true. Like it's substantially different from many other countries. But do you find like going by, how does Germany handle immigration? Germany tends to handle a lot of stuff fairly cleanly, like looking up what countries have the seemingly like smoothest.
Yeah, like I do think that's. I mean, I've done that for lots of other things like drug policy and stuff like that. Is oftentimes a gold mine for that. And but man, I haven't done that yet. That would be probably the next step in like the research process. I'm interested. So it sounds like your research process is to get like the arguments and then get really into like this is the foundational stuff that we are debating about. Some of the places that I went were like the Department of Homeland Security are the ones that publishes immigration statistics.
So that's useful if nothing else, just so you've got a good grasp on like the real background, like the current state of it. So, it's between like 10 and 11 undocumented citizens or undocumented persons living in the US at this time. And that's, I think, going to be one of the more challenging pieces of the debate, is that like, okay, great, we changed the policy for people that want to come to the US, but what about for those people that are currently in the US? Because it becomes this bit of friction between, okay, do we uphold the law again to that like, do we uphold the law to the highest standard that says like, well, technically they've broken the law that says they couldn't come here and therefore, out you go? Or is it like, do we grant amnesty, or is it just a path to say,
Yeah, see, like,
are here? Like those
this
have to be in place,
conversation,
and that's not removing restrictions necessarily.
Like giving amnesty?
Right. Yeah. So that's
yeah,
like
it's not removing statutory restrictions. Right.
Right. Like,
right.
I mean, I guess the statutory restriction at that place is like that you are not a citizen, and we remove the restriction that says you're not a citizen. Like that would be a tricky way to wordsmith it, but like I couldn't believe
how
many times amnesty has been used as the like effective tool to, like, let's make a blank slate and write new immigration policy. Like Reagan granted amnesty 3 times. Like the patron saint of the current GOP granted amnesty to undocumented persons 3 separate times. So I think that there's precedent for some of this stuff that I think there needs to be a blank slate. I think if you look at like healthcare was probably the previous similarly overly complicated, really messed up system that we had. And I think the bickering and fighting back and forth that created our current healthcare system or healthcare insurance system maybe made it worse, right? Like you ended up with just a gutted policy that didn't really help the people that needed it, or didn't help a large swath. So I would hope that there's some way to wipe the slate clean with immigration policy so it does not become the bungled mess that healthcare became, right? Like, because it's going to be contentious. I would hope that there's some way to wipe the slate clean in between policy changeover. And it seems like amnesty has been that tool.
Yeah, I think that like there's good reason to, I could see why immigration is a federal issue, whereas, the like healthcare could be a little bit more delegated, you know what I mean? Especially considering like how regional differences could affect people's health and what the type of coverage they need. But yeah, the immigration policy, I don't know, man. Like I think I'm starting to see just the hints of like critical arguments about whether or not this is originating from statute or just from the people in charge. You know what I mean? It's like, you know what I mean? And so it might be like more statutes good. Like, cause like if you look at the resolution, it's basically, if you took away immigration, all it's saying is less statutes good. And the other side gets to say more statutes good, And so like if we clarified our immigration policy more in the law rather than less, then that would remove the power from people who get to just sort of make decisions on,
And I think that's a really useful piece when you start talking some of the like the political theory that goes into it. So one of the things that the Center for American Progress was pointing out was that there's this seemingly like back and forth nature, particularly on immigration, between the rule of law and the rule of men.
Yeah.
Joking, like tongue in cheek, because it is all men, unfortunately. So like the patriarch of that aside, it came from like a quote from John Adams that I guess like dated back further than that. But John Adams was saying like it needs to be a nation governed by laws, not governed by people. Right. Yeah. So, and that, which makes sense, so that the laws last a whole lot longer and not just the winds of, whatever Twitter said.
Yeah. And you can see like the critical argument starting, like there's probably a way better way that somebody way smarter than me wrote about it. You know what I mean? It's like, but I'm kind of, and now I would start gravitating towards, I'm like, all right, let's start finding some critical authors on that.
I think that this will, while I started out this by saying that the whole like remove borders entirely position probably won't go far, maybe I roll that back. I think that there actually is a huge amount of tremendous literature on that, to like the only reason why there exist the borders where they are and why they are was because like colonists came over and drew those lines in the sand and took the land away from other people with, genocide on the other side of it many times over. So I think there's plenty of good ground to say that like borders themselves are genocidal they're harmful. They are colonialists. Like they're
the borders critique, right? I think, that one's already like written basically. Like that's
sure. I feel like this will allow it to go to another level because you now have infinite research, right? Like it's not just a. I think the arguments back against it that you typically see in like a parley round are like, well, we didn't have the time to prepare for something this deep, and so here are different ways we can interact or whatever, and that's great for it. I think LD, like I would hope that it really advances that theoretical conversation. Like I would hope that there are perms on it, and like, all right, let's really clarify like what would it actually look like if there were not borders, right? Yeah. Like, as I think it is too easy to say like, oh, well, what about people that come over, and have committed acts of terrorism in their own company or country or whatever. Like there's some easy little things that if not fleshed out with months of research behind it, the case can start to fall apart. But when you have the ability to really detail out like what would this look like, that's where I kind of enjoy watching the debates that are a much more extreme version of a policy rather than let's like retool this bungled mess. Like, let's completely wipe this slate clean and start over with like, why do we need borders? Why do we need immigration policy? Like, why does there have to be rules around it? I think that those are really worthwhile topics to explore. So love for like people to throw up in comments and stuff like different either piece of literature or authors.
Yeah. Like, no, I like it. It's been a long time since I've heard a borders critique. And so I'm sure people got some back files on that one. I would definitely be prepared for it because that would be a great affirmative sort of, a curveball for some. For some. Like one of the things is I just kind of, I'm in the forensics community. And so I remember stuff, like as I'm searching for content for my students, I come across videos all the time. The one I'm going to put up here in the comments, or at least a link to it. And it's the AFA winner of persuasive speaking from 2018. It's about H4 visas, and those are they're known as dependent visas, and 90% of these visa holders are women, and they're only allowed to like open a bank account or get a job with their husband's permission. And if he like dies, then she gets deported. It's like, it's a really horrible system set up for the visas, and it even comes with some detailed solutions and stuff like that. Points to legislation that you can back or write to your representative about and things like. And so those are I find sometimes there's old persuasions that are on point and just kind of craft them into a debate round.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I like that a lot. And I think in most other instances, I would recommend finding existing legislation that you can start backing or at least start like pulling from. And maybe that's still a good idea to pull from some ideas that, large bodies have already collected the research and put them together. But unlike other, debate years when that you've got a consistent administration going through, or at least consistent groups year, like because you already can know this is going to be volatile, I would not latch on to a particular policy this year because it's going to change over the course of the year, which like LD, does naturally. Like cases have to shift and adapt, like even between tournaments. But I would probably go for more something like you're talking about of like finding out the limitations on what a statute really is and what you can start playing. Like how do you toe the line of what a statute is and, what pieces you want to remove and just start, chipping away at that.
Right. Because I mean, like if, like you said, when you came across the amnesty, I'm like, why didn't I think of amnesty? And then if I think another second about it, it's like amnesty isn't a statute. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, I mean, there are rules about amnesty in the statutes, but that's not what happened in the 1980s. You know what I mean? It's like that was, and so, yeah. I mean, I think there's a bit of cleverness to the wording that is novel for now. You know what I mean? But I think the more I get into it, and I'm sure anyone watching might be able to. They might know a bit more about this or might be able to find lit a little bit, that explains it a little bit better than we understand it. But that's my first impressions, it means that the statutory, if you're going to be, like beholden to the resolution, that a lot of the stuff that's in the news isn't about statutes necessarily. You'd have to go a little deeper than that. Otherwise you're just talking about the whims of powerful people.
And, you know, one last thing that I wanted to make sure to mention, because I had wished that I had thought of this when I competed, the utility of going to like humans as resources. When I was competing, like immigration attorneys are abound and they are super knowledgeable on the subjects because they're dealing with cases every day and they know what the most like problematic things are, the stuff that they're seeing all the time. They know what cases are, you know, causing problems and how the law should change. Like they've, I'm sure, got opinions on it and they've got good legal justifications. And I would highly recommend reaching out to immigration attorneys because they would probably be stoked to talk about this kind of stuff anyways, because odds are they probably did mock trial or debate or something when they were in school too. So I would highly recommend reaching out to just qualified, smart people like immigration attorneys for this topic.
I came across fwd.us. And it, you know, I was looking into it. Oh wow, there's some big people that are on the founders about it. It seemed pretty well designed and seemed like the information was good. And all I did was I sent out a question, and I'm gonna see if they, you know, respond. But yeah, that's the, you know, jumping off with just reach out to somebody who might actually be of some use. Like one time, I don't know, I had a question and I'm like, man, I bet Noam Chomsky could answer this. And I wrote an email to Noam Chomsky.
Did you really?
He responded.
What?
You know, like, yeah.
Did you really?
I got emails from Noam Chomsky in my inbox right now about linguistics questions, you know?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, people are stoked to answer questions, like, when they're knowledgeable. So definitely reach out. And also, like, even if you're doing something entirely unrelated to debate, like you're having a persuasive round about it, there are few things that I find more impressive as a judge than when someone says in an interview with the author, I'm like, oh, this kid did the research. Like, that is so many points because everyone's got Google, but like, hey, you got to reach out and talk to a person. That's scary. So that's a level that most people will not go to. Highly recommend it.
Yeah. Hey, anybody watching this live or in a recording, if you are doing the NFA-LD topic or anything like that, I would love to have some discussion. I use it for instructional material. I use the current topic in my class for instruction. And so this is day one of a very long project that's going to be, you know, that I'm going to have dozens and dozens of students looking into and researching and stuff like that. I think the more people, the merrier when it comes to that. So just, you know, if you want to reach out. Okay. All right. Anything else for the good of the order, Tim?
I would implore that you ask journalists to write an article on this subject, because if they care about just like the clicks to their, you know, local news site, write this, because you know how many thousands and thousands of LD prospective competitors are about to be Googling this. So if nothing else, like put good information out there. Like journalists, I would hope that you cover these specific things. Future voters and existing voters like are looking into it. So useful stuff for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We got to do this again for like the policy topics.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the high school and college and stuff like that. We got to look that up.
High school one is outstanding.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Cool. Yeah. So anyone watching, you know that when we, when that next topic, if it's already come out, we'll do that as soon as possible. But if it's coming out, we're going to look up the date on that. All right. You can let us know. All right. Hey, we have here Tim CV, Visolutions, San Diego State University. I'm Jared Miller. I am your professor of communications, debate coach. All right. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Okay. All right. Thanks.